In any type of practical initiation work, one of the first things that you need to become aware of is that we're surrounded by non-physical beings, and they're actually communicating with us all the time. However, if we're not developed to the point that we can receive those communications fully consciously, then those communications will then enter into our structure according to our present level of development. Meaning that, for example, if you're not fully conscious at the areas above the head, you will not be able to receive what we refer to as packed thought forms, or highly compressed information in the way that angelic beings would communicate with one another. It is possible to develop that capacity, but most human beings do not have it currently. If we are not fully conscious in receiving these communications in our thinking faculties, then we will not be fully conscious as far as conceptual clarity about the information that we're receiving. What will usually happen then is that the communication then will either activate our feeling life or will activate our will life. And so our feelings will then get activated with emotional movements for us to take particular types of actions based on the influence from the spiritual beings, or it will go directly into the will. And so, for example, you might ask a person, why did you come to this class? Or why did you move to this place? And they may say, I really have no idea why, I just knew I had to be there. I knew I had to do that thing. And that's usually a sign that the impulse from the spiritual being went straight into the will and was not able to be received fully consciously at the higher centers. So there's a complete process of developing these centers and being able to be conscious of the presence and communications of spiritual beings. And we're going to be looking again at some of the different principles behind this type of work, drawn from multiple traditions on this weekend. And again, this work is very important because if we do not take in the impulses from the spiritual beings fully consciously, then in addition to the fact of it will then go into other centers of our development that are not quite as conscious, it can actually sometimes take on pathological forms. And we're going to be talking about that later in the weekend. So there's actually a type of spiritual imperative at this moment in human development for us to actually become conscious of communication with spiritual beings. If it doesn't happen, then certain pathological forms of the impulses they're trying to bring us will become more prominent in the world. And this has always been the case in human development. At certain points, in certain time cycles, there will be certain forward movements in human evolution and human consciousness that if they're not taken up fully consciously, then again, various pathological forms of those impulses will manifest in their place. So that's the basic foundation of what we're doing this weekend, looking at the principles and the practice of communicating with spiritual beings. Because people aren't initiated anymore in a specific classical system, we get bits and pieces of information, and the fragments of information we get are sometimes missing major pieces of information that one would have gotten in a classical tradition. And so, for example, one thing we'll look at and get clarity on is the difference between connecting to what someone like Rudolf Steiner would refer to as a hierarchical spiritual being, a spiritual being whose evolutionary process is actually much more advanced than a human being, who's much more conscious and developed than the average state of human consciousness, versus beings that are at a group mind level that are, in a sense, below the stage of human consciousness that we often refer to as elemental beings. And even there, we need to differentiate between what's classically known as the elemental beings, that are the elemental beings of the physical elements, earth, air, fire, water, and the elemental beings that are actually generated by human beings, that we generate with our own mind power all the time. That's the focus of other traditions, such as the work of Stylianos of Teshlus, better known as Daskalos, the great Greek Christian Hermetic teacher from the island of Cyprus, who focused very much on these types of human-generated elementals. And other traditions will teach about them as well. They're called the tulpas by the Tibetans, for example. We all generate them, and they have a very different quality than the nature elementals. So that's why sometimes we use the term artificial elementals in some traditions for those that are human-generated, versus the elementals generated by the higher hierarchical beings. So it's essential in communicating with beings outside of oneself to have at least some fundamental understandings of the different types of beings. And so in the table of contents, some of the first things here are the fundamental context for understanding spiritual beings and 3 essential stages of spiritual discernment. Unfortunately, spiritual discernment is one of those things that did not get fully carried over from classical spiritual traditions into modern metaphysics. Spiritual discernment is often lacking. because there's not a clear differentiation of the different forces that we're exposed to. And so we'll talk about some of the fundamentals of this tonight. And then, on your table of contents, perceiving the spirit in other human beings. That's where we're going to start. Before we start looking for non-physical spiritual beings, we're going to start with the spiritual beings that are right in front of us all the time, which is basically one another. We're all spiritual beings. We simply have a physical embodiment at the moment, so you can actually see them with your physical eyes in front of you. So one of the best places to start is always start with things at the most grounded level, and that is seeing the spiritual nature, the reality within every human being in front of us. So we'll start with that tonight in a particular practice I'll tell you more about a bit later. So that's most of what we're doing tonight. And then in the coming days, we're going to be looking at the classical European system. Starts with the old Jewish Kabbalah as a revision of what was actually part of the Egyptian mysteries before that, and then from the Jewish Kabbalah moved into what we sometimes think of as the Christian Kabbalah, and particularly in the form that it's taught today by people like Rudolf Steiner, which is linked to certain medieval teachings. And that is about 9 different types or ranks of what we think of as angelic beings, or what Steiner would refer to as the spiritual hierarchies. And the term spiritual hierarchies goes back in modern times to the work of Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote the book On the Celestial Hierarchies, which first came out around the time of the court of Charlemagne and has been very influential for Western metaphysics since that time. This is a fundamental system that we should understand in modern initiation for differentiating different higher hierarchical levels of being. Now, it's very common that in modern metaphysics, these different ranks of the angelic hierarchies are dealt with quite abstractly, and we don't want to leave things abstract. With a spiritual science, we want them to be clear in our cognitive understanding of them. And so we're then going to look at how these angelic hierarchies manifest with a type of spiritual development system with human beings. And so that leads to the part of our handout that's called Angelic Hierarchies as Alchemical Stages of Consciousness. All the higher hierarchies have names that reflect their function. They do different things, and they have different levels of consciousness that allow them to perform those functions. It's a kind of 9-step ladder above the human being that human beings can attain those states of consciousness. Some human beings have attained a state of consciousness that's equal to what we refer to as the angelic beings. Not angelic in terms of all higher beings, but of the angels per se. And some have attained the state of consciousness of archangels. Some maybe even of archai, or even higher. This gives us a sense of what these actual alchemical crystallizations of consciousness are. I've never seen this particular system I'm describing here in any external text. It simply became self-evident to me at a certain point. And for everything that we're teaching you, because we're approaching things here at the Vesica Institute, and with my own teaching as a spiritual science, that means that it's not a charismatic transmission. I'm not asking you to believe anything based on any charismatic authority. We want to give it out in as clear and conscious a form as possible, and you don't need to buy into any of it until it becomes self-evident to you. If it's real, at some point it'll become self-evident. If not, it's just somebody else's story, which may be helpful for our own development, but it's nothing that we have to subscribe to. So it's not a dogmatic thing. But this just simply became apparent to me as something self-evident over time, and I know for other people, it's become apparent to them as well. Then, how spiritual beings connect to and influence human beings. This is actually a vast topic. We could easily spend a week on this topic alone. And so we're just going to introduce some very common basic aspects of this. Then, 3 current activities of the angeloi in the human astral body. Now, this is a very important section, and it's going to actually end our class on Sunday. There was a very important part of Rudolf Steiner's teaching that had to do with clarifying the nature of spiritual beings and how one directly perceives and interacts with them. And so at one time in 1918, Steiner was approached by someone who asked them, how are we interacting with, and they would ask about these very high levels of spiritual hierarchies. How are we interacting with the thrones or the cherubim or something like that? And Steiner says, most people don't even have the capacity to really conceive of the level of consciousness and activity of a being of that level. So let's start a little bit closer to home. What are the angels doing with human beings right now? The angelic hierarchy the closest to us. And this led to a remarkable lecture from Rudolf Steiner that was called The Work of the Angels in Man's Astral Body. That for people that are very aware of Steiner's work is a very important fundamental lecture. And so I'm going to give you some parts of that lecture and take it a little bit further on Sunday. And this will also illustrate for us a very important principle about how if we don't take in those impulses fully consciously, they can take on a pathological form. Any type of impulse that we are given in our life that we do not act on consciously and integrate in a beneficial manner can sometimes turn detrimental. And so we're going to be looking at the specifics of that, mostly based on Steiner's work at that point. Then, 4 awareness levels of impulses coming from spiritual beings. This is a more detailed description of what I started the class with today, talking about the way that we can take in the angelic communications or any type of spiritual beings, non-physical communications, at a superconscious level, or at a conscious level, or at a subconscious level, or at a deep subconscious level. And we'll be talking in more detail about exactly what that means. And it'll hopefully lead to your recognizing in yourself about how certain impulses have come in for you at different levels at different times.